You're listening to the Slavic Literature Pod, your shelf-help guide to all things Slavic. I'm Cameron Lalana, and if you want to learn more about Slavic literature, art, and culture, then you're in the right place. Today, we're talking tractors, baby. That's right, it's time for Soviet cinema. We'll be going over Oleksandr Dovzhenko's 1930 classic Earth, the final work in a trilogy which has been now, posthumously dubbed, depending on where you read it, either the Silent Trilogy or the Ukraine Trilogy. I might have been inspired by a recent conversation with Ali about a book, actually. But of course, as you know, Ali Pitts hosts a podcast about Slavic movies. And also, unfortunately, I've been very busy lately, so I haven't had time to finish Chevengur because it is quite a large book. So I thought, let's talk about some other stuff around collectivization or, the Sovietization of this period. So Earth, that seems like a good candidate. It's been a film in the back of my mind for a long time. And also one that should be relatively easy to talk about, right? No, turns out not the case at all. Still, I've read so many research papers, and I feel like I'm still scratching the surface. So Dovzhenko is someone we are, and I'm going to give you a spoiler here, going to be coming back to, because I, at this point, don't feel prepared. However, I am once again leaving town on an obligation tomorrow, so we really got to get this out today. Not that that means that this is a half-baked episode, but rather we're going to be going a little light on the author portion and getting more into the movie itself, putting a pin in that one to come back to later. Now, as long as we're here, I also wanted to mention that as of Wednesday, assuming you're listening to this on Friday, might be further back if you are listening in the future, we are marking 5 years of the Slavic Literature Pod, and I just want to say to everyone that's listening, thank you. I say it often enough, but every time I really do mean it. It is very nice to know that I am not talking into the void. Sometimes I will post an episode and someone will email me with something in that episode, and I'll be frank with you, it's a little frightening to remember that people actually listen to this, but all the same, nice that you are here, so I appreciate it. And I especially appreciate it. You've probably seen that the posting schedule has been a little uneven this year. That is, it's an uneven schedule due to, not to get too much into personal stuff, but some uneven mental health, which I think we're on the upside on. So we've been doing more planning for the new year, looking forward to more guests, and I am excited for what's coming. But let's now turn to Earth, and let's start off with why Earth? Why Earth rather than anything else? And it is more than that we need something to fit in between the Chevengur episodes, although that's part of it. That's why it got fast-tracked to right now. But Earth is something I've wanted to talk about for a while because we've talked a fair bit about early Soviet literature in this really interesting period where we have still this kind of rising, I'm going to call it radicalism for lack of a better term. This belief that a new world is not only possible, but a new world is being born right now. So we are the ones who are thinking about how to create it, right? This is downstream of what is to be done, where, of course, the radicalism of the revolution and the Rakhmetov is still kind of far off, keeping in mind that Chernyshevsky was writing that in prison, so we couldn't get too hard on that. But the other features of revolution, like upending the expectations of gender between our two main characters, a man and a woman, of what their relationship should be, is not what it is, right? That they don't sleep together, that they are equals, that she, unfortunately, I've forgotten her name. And the only name I remember from What Is to Be Done is Rakhmetov, of course, the absolute unit. But she's running this sewing co-op, and it's becoming incredibly successful with many happy workers. And you can trace it through to that era, reading about Alexandra Kollontais, The Love of Worker Bees, right? That's where we're getting into not only the revolution, but the need for changes in how, in the treatment of women, especially, right? That even in this new burgeoning socialist society, granted still in the very early days, the problem of sexual exploitation is still something that needs to be tackled, right? We covered that in Sisters, a great short story. And I could keep going on, but that's going to detract from the point of the episode, right? We're in this weird period where everyone is putting forth the ideas for what the future could be or should be, and they're doing that in support of like the Bolshevik Party, now the Soviets who've won the war, right? Now we've won. Now we can create this society. We get to critique, well, depending on where you are in the years, we get to critique what's happening so we can correct it, or we have to support what's going on to make sure that it stays stable, right? And it produces such a fascinating body of work in this era, which is why I love early Soviet literature and movies so much, right? They're kind of strange and very earnest, which I deeply enjoy, which is true of Earth. So you got to keep in mind that Earth is in 1930, and this is after Stalin has come to power. And so things are changing around this period, right? They've been changing. And I think Earth is a great example of sort of this older art, not much older, right? Art that would have been probably much better received 6 or 7 years back, which is now a little more problematic for the director. And before we get into why that is, let's talk about Oleksandr Dovzhenko himself. Dovzhenko is born in 1894 in the small Ukrainian village of Sosnitsia, which is in sort of north-central Ukraine, along a tributary river of the Desna River. And he's born to a peasant family, one of somewhere between 7 and 14 children. I've seen conflicting articles on that, and maybe you're going to get the sense a little bit here of why I want to put more time into researching him. I think there's a lot more to talk about here in terms of not only his early life, but also his influences, in which it's not like a ton of disagreement, but there seems to be some lack of clarity here, which I think deserves a much deeper dive at a later time when we have the time. But so he's born to a peasant family, but manages to, through various reasons, graduate from a teacher's college. Eventually, in 1917, that's when he appears to get involved in the Bolsheviks. Although at some point earlier, he maybe was involved with a more politically nationalist, Ukrainian nationalist groups, and continues to work. After possibly fighting, it seems unclear whether he was like an instructor or a fighter. I've seen different reports on that. Maybe those are different eras. Again, something that needs more research on my end. And begins to work as a Ukrainian newspaper. He goes to Germany and studies art there, and starts his film career ultimately in 1926, at which point he would be about 32, releasing a couple films, which he does not seem to, as far as I can tell from other writers, does not seem to think much of later, before getting to his kind of his main three: Zvenigoria, Arsenal, and finally Zemlya, or Earth. The three which make up either the silent trilogy or the Ukrainian trilogy, depending on how you want to talk about it. Now, Earth is released this is in a fairly small period of time, actually, one after the other. Zvenigoria is 1928, Arsenal is 1929, and Earth is 1930. After that, you're going to start seeing more years placed between his work. Ivan, 1932, Arograd in 1935, Shores in 1939, and so on and such forth. And Dovzhenko was kind of in this weird place in this era, right, in the late 20s to early 30s, where he would alternately win great awards and also get great criticism. Arsenal was apparently towing the line with Soviet leadership at the time, although Stalin appeared to have liked it. So it kind of got a pass. Now, Zemlya, or Earth, this is an interesting one. As we'll talk about what in the plot, from our perspective today, at least when I was watching it, you might not immediately think, oh, this is something that would get Soviet leadership mad, or, not just leadership, but also other members of society at the time, other critics, other artists, right? However, it did. It was accused of pantheism, which seems funny to us now, but was a much more serious allegation at the time. A litany of other terms, being kind of pro-kulak, expressing Ukrainian nationalism, all these things which put him in a more awkward position, and not enough that it would, get him, that he would be purged in the later 30s. In fact, he was still kind of in contact with, he was not close, but he was still working with, right, official Sovietum. Think of it's kind of similar to Vasily Grossman, right, before he's getting into Stalingrad and Life and Fate, where he's kind of still technically a part of the system, still working in these writers' circles, still, a part of Soviet society, but slowly being kind of walked out. Not in the way that he's about to be arrested and shot, as he obviously never was, but it's kind of being pushed out of polite society, right? And that doesn't happen as much to Dovzhenko. He continues making films, although under greater pressure, and reading some writings from his later years with much greater regret over this path, working with people who now dislike his work, dislike him, all this criticism which is constantly coming at his work. It becomes much more difficult for him, although not enough that he is ever arrested, for example. Before he eventually dies in 1956 in Moscow. He's living in Moscow at the time, moving there from Ukraine, partially to kind of fight back against these allegations of Ukrainian nationalism in this era of socialism in one country, right? Where you go from kind of, not that this is like a line, but you've got this era of Bolshevism where it's international, right? The revolution, communism has to win everywhere, kind of progressing to, well, socialism needs to win here first before it can go anywhere else, right? This policy of socialism in one country, which early on still was more, I don't want to say considerate, but more interested in the world in its component parts. And I say that because, in the 20s, you have the policy of koordinization. I'm excited to bring that back up. I haven't gotten to talk about koordinization in a long time, kind of heartization. That was the policy of almost adapting socialism for the individual republics in the Soviet Union at the time, bringing in, national characteristics into the propaganda, into the work, all these things to kind of emphasize that before that becomes a sign of nationalism as a bad thing. As a purely bad thing. But for that to make sense, maybe we should talk more about the movie itself. And I'm going to give first a brief plot summary and then talk more about what makes this movie interesting. Because the plot doesn't matter so much. It's about a tractor coming to a town. It is about a small Ukrainian village in which there are older generations and kulaks and young peasants, poorer ones mostly, who are opposed to the coming policy of collectivization, which is not being done by Soviet authorities, but is being done by themselves. With the arrival of the tractor, the young, the new Bolsheviks, who are, again, not party members per se in the way we think of them. They are the local members of the party, the people from this village who are now saying, well, now this is all our land, and we've got this tractor, and look how much faster this tractor goes than you're moving around with a scythe and oxen trying to till and cut these fields. And that produces some consternation enough that one of the leaders of this movement, a man named Vasil, is shot and killed by one of the kulaks, a man named Homa. And the back half of the film is about Vasil's father, Opanas, beginning to kind of come around to his son's belief system, whereas early in the film he is rejecting it, and some really great argumentation scenes where he begins to confront the kulaks. He, when the priest shows up, sends the priest away. He goes to the local council and says to them, I do not want a traditional religious burial for my son. I want something that celebrates the future. Essentially, I want the young people, your people, to carry him, singing songs not of death, but of life. And we go to this final moment in the movie where a crowd of people are gathering, carrying Vasil's body to be buried, while we are kind of getting interspersed images of not only this funeral march of people singing, as with Opanas walking at the head, not only Vasil being carried in a coffin, but also Vasil's mother, who remains unnamed, giving birth. The priest who has been sent away alone in his church, begging God to smite the sinners out there, with Vasil's lover and or fiance. I've seen her referred to it both ways. Trying to find a polite way to say this. Having a breakdown, I think, is a reasonable thing to say after your lover dies. And also a Communist Party organizer giving a speech at Vasil's future, pointing to how his death is one step on the way to the future, while Roma stands at the side of the funeral in anger and apparent maybe guilt, angrily confessing to the murder of Vasil. Not that anyone cares, so entranced are they by the Soviet orator and his pointing to a plane in the sky saying, look, we may have lost Vasil today, but he lives on in that tractor, in this Soviet airplane, in all these ways that we are going to make the future ours, because this is our land, our Earth, not the kulaks, ours, and it is our future. But just talking about the plot, and that's the plot of the film, but just talking about the plot kind of undersells what's going on here, because what makes Dovzhenko interesting is not so much his ability to tell a story. In fact, this is based on a real story of the murder of an organizer of a collective farm, but it is and I really have to insist that you watch this, actually. It is a little over an hour long. It is a silent film, which for some people may be a turnoff. I think it's actually rather exciting. These are... I can't get into every silent film. The original Nosferatu, not for me. But this is a really invigorating one because of Dovzhenko's style. And you can watch it for free in a lot of places. I found like 6 different versions, at least on YouTube. In fact, I'll link a couple in the description of this podcast. Something to keep in mind is obviously we don't have official music. It would have been played live at the time. So there is varying music on all of these, and your mileage may vary in the music on any of the ones I link. You can also watch it on Canopy, which is free if you have a library card. That's where I watched it initially before watching it a second time on a channel which actually has it in its original Ukrainian rather than in Russian, which has also, by the way, this one that's linked, it's going to be called Earth, in parentheses, 1930, X Biju spelled B-I-J-U with an umlaut. Now, this one is the best quality I've seen anywhere, which, based on the comments of the channel, they work with the Dovzhenko Center, so maybe that makes sense that they've got such a good quality one. I will note that the music used in this one is not old music. In fact, it seems to be, Biju is the artist who's producing new... I don't really know how to describe the music. I want to call it ambient, but that's not correct. But quite distinctively modern music, and your mileage may vary on that. Although I will say, even listening to some of the other music used in the other versions I've seen across YouTube, Canopy, and some other places, even old music doesn't always fit depending on the scene. I've seen quite often the funeral scene in which the people are supposed to be singing, songs of life, secular songs in the new socialist reality, in which they use strangely church-like choirs, which doesn't quite fit either. So the fact that it's new music doesn't bother me. It's its own experience. In fact, it's actually kind of a fun idea, I think, is making new tracks to silent films. But let's leave that there. So the really interesting thing about Earth is its cinematography, is its deployment of montage, and the way that the camera is used in the film. I would be here all day if I talked about the whole thing beginning to end, because one thing I should point out is that this film is fairly, let's call it loose. So when we talk about, montage, this theory of editing, you're probably most familiar with it being associated with Eisenstein, right? Who is using montage to create meaning in the mind of the audience without explicitly saying it. The most vivid example probably is Strike, which we've talked about on this channel before. You've got, at the end of the movie, soldiers shooting down the striking workers, which then cuts to footage of a cow being slaughtered, of it being stabbed in the neck and it bleeding out as its eyes widen and go wild before finally slumping over, likening the killing of the striking workers not just as this horrible event that's happening, but as the slaughter of a cow, like the slaughter of cattle, of something that is not only being killed but killed for the sake of profit. It's used a little bit less directly here, right? You have these pretty solid meanings that are created in your mind. And maybe not that one exactly. Maybe it's a little bit more on the line of just the horror of this moment, seeing the cow's eye kind of go wild and then slowly fade. You might find that the most shocking thing, but it's going to lead you in similar directions. Now, Earth uses this idea of montage a little more loosely. It's not a tight film, and I mean that in the sense that these shots are not they're not what we expect, right? We're used to a sort of continuity. When a character looks off at something, we expect to see what they're looking at. We expect one moment from the other to be continuing the movie, unless it is meant to be a jump. Although occasionally there are films that do play with that, of course. There always are artists who do. However, more often than not, that's the case. When we are in the same scene and when we go to another scene, it's quite obvious. Not so on Earth. It's not really that interested in making those connections for you. You'll jump around from scenes of Earth to people just staring in the distance, to orchards, to harvests, with no apparent, and I'm going to lean heavily on the word apparent here, connection between these things, because of course the meaning is still being created in your mind. You get that relationship with the director, but not one that's as tight as Eisenstein, right? And that's something I noticed, because there are many moments in this film, some particularly not even pivotal, but maybe just iconic in the literal sense of they become like icons in of themselves, in which I've seen 4 or 5 different interpretations of them, and ones that frankly are not mutually exclusive. They're just different takes on it that don't exclude each other, which I think is really cool. Normally when you get into that, you'll see people arguing over the exact all these different ideas which cannot coexist. In this case, most of these ideas, and I lean on most, we'll talk about a paper I found that I got some issues with later, most of these ideas can coexist, because for the most part, when they're examining a static shot. So you're kind of bringing a lot of yourself into that and a lot of your own reading of the film into each of these moments, which I think is actually really cool. And that may sound basic. That's kind of what we do all the time, but there's so much more room for it here because there's so much less text. It's a lot more visual, in a very good way. But to really examine this, let's talk about just the intro and the outro of the film, because if we got away from that, we could truly be here all day. So Earth begins on open fields of wheat blowing in the breeze. Never held for very long, a couple seconds, but still a static shot. Wind blowing across the wheat, clouds hanging lazily overhead, being pushed on, before finally we see our first human subject, a young woman standing next to a sunflower. And then we go to various shots of apples in an orchard. And finally we come to a man sitting looking down at another man lying on the ground in this orchard. And we begin to cut around from him to other people in the crowd as it becomes apparent that this man on the ground, Semyon, is dying. His friend asks him when you get there, when you go, Semyon, let me know where you end up in heaven or in hell. And Semyon says, okay, I will. And the interesting thing about this, as this continues on, he eventually sits up, asks for a pear, eats it, and lies down and says, Umirayu, I'm dying, I'll die, and does. And the interesting thing about this scene is not the literal action, although of course it sets it up. Semyon is the father of Opanas and the grandfather of Vasil, the conflicting father and son duo who kind of form this tension throughout the film of the Soviet approach of modernity, let's call that loosely. But these are normally, if in a film, you might expect something like that, a wide establishing shot, a crowd placing you in the orchard, seeing the people looking down at Semyon. But you don't get that here. You're almost exclusively close-ups. In fact, the fact that you're in an orchard is only made apparent by the fact that you can see tree trunks in the background of the Semyon's friend, and you assume that that's the orchard that you saw moments ago. Although, of course, something you saw moments ago is not a good indicator in this movie in general, because the next shot might not be related in a literal sense or in a logical sense. It might be operating on a bit of what I've seen often called dream logic. And each of these shots of people, they're staring off into the distance. You presume it's Semyon, but you never quite know what, because there's never a reverse shot for all these faces, and it's quite a few. It's quite a large crowd here as they all look off. Presumably it's Semyon, but maybe it's something else. You never really know. Also in there is a child eating a fruit who Semyon appears to stare at while eating his own pear before dying. And then that leads into the group having an argument about whether or not he deserves an order, like an order of labor for this, and whether or not orders of labor are given out for that sort of thing. And of course, as Vasil says, they're not given out for carrying, moving an oxen around for 60 years. And another interesting... And after that point, obviously this is a silent film, so all the dialogue is given in these inner titles. And the first interesting thing happens in this film. Not the first interesting thing. This is the thing that first made me pause the movie and start looking around. Is that when Vasil and his grandfather's friends start arguing over that, there are no inner titles. They're simply arguing with each other. And I thought, this must be a mistake. So I started looking at other versions. I went to outside of Canopy to basically every version on YouTube. And in every version, there was not any dialogue. And I began to realize, I think this is how it was meant to be. And that happens repeatedly throughout the film. There are 3 major moments in which big conversations happen back and forths, in which we have no context for them. Now, that may or may not be how it was intended. And I'm going to pull from an article here. This is an article that I read and I enjoyed greatly. I'm going to link it down in the description. It's called Offscreen Dreams and Collective Synthesis and Dovzhenko's Earth by Elizabeth A. Papazian. Now, if you want the short version of this episode, you can probably just go read this paper, which you can find in the description. I think Papazian gets it on the head, although we'll talk about some other people later on who also have some interesting stuff. Papazian points out that after it was released, it was, of course, attacked by other contemporaries. And let me quote here from Papazian directly. Following Bedny's attacks, was a poet at the time, cuts were made to the film. These cuts were restored in the reconstructed version of the film released in the 1960s. So we are, in fact, watching the full edit of the film itself. I have also referenced the 35mm Gondofilm font print held at the archive of the National Center of Oleksandr Dovzhenko in Kiev. At present, the intertitling of the original is unknown. The original Ukrainian titles no longer exist. So when it was released originally, it was in Ukrainian, translated to Russian. And if there were intertitles between these moments, unknown. There may not have been, there may have been that were cut and lost. However, Papazian argues that this totally works, that it doesn't really matter that we don't actually get to hear their conversation because the intricacies don't matter that much. This is not literally a film about Marxism. It's a film about the coming of Soviet communism, which may or may not relate to Marxism, depending on who you're talking to and what work you're talking about. Going back to Chevengur for a second, I thought it was a very interesting thing that we have characters who are all, our main trio of communists all have completely different ideas of what communism is, all clearly not very well educated on Marxist theory, which is relevant because not everyone did have that great idea, right? Think back to cement. Cement, which is not a good analogy for this movie because for various reasons. I don't have time to get into them, but right, the true Marxists, the people opposed to the NEP, saying there's none of this in the texts. This is just simply us giving in, bringing back capitalism, and they are ejected in favor of the old czarist officials who were brought back in, right? A lot of places and times, as usually as most people are not that interested in the intricacies of political education. Pains me to say it, but it's something we all have to recognize. And that's where you're getting a lot of these more political works that frankly have been lost to time. There are some political works which are good enough that they overcome that. I think Earth is one of them, that it is a piece of propaganda. Yes, it is a piece arguing for collectivization, ultimately. However, it is not really dealing with the actual politics, right? The extent of communism is really just a tractor. Look, this is technological progress. Communism is electrification. Communism is we no longer have to do all of this with oxes and scythes and with these manual tools. We have machines now to do this. And that's kind of the extent of it. The more in-depth political conversations, like I mentioned, are not intertitled. So was that something that was criticized, or was that something that was just not relevant? It was not included in the first place. Unknown, but all the same, the film still works. And let me talk about something else that Papazian introduces here in reference to the fact that everyone in this opening scene is always staring at something. This is something you see throughout the movie. People are often looking, and sometimes you ultimately do get something they're looking at. In the case of after the funeral, you have a crowd of people, again, shot all more or less individually, sometimes with one other person in the frame at something. And eventually you've come to find out they're looking at a tractor after quite a long period of time. But oftentimes you often don't find out what someone's looking at. And I'm just going to read a quote here, which is kind of a longer quote, but I think it's important here. Off-screen space, or the space outside the frame, comes into play with on-screen space in several ways, in particular through entries into and exits from the frame, off-screen glances, partial framing of a character, and camera movement. As Noel Birch points out, quote, any film employs movements into and out of frame. Any film suggests an opposition between screen spaces and off-screen space through the use of such devices as off-screen glances, the shot and reverse shot, partially out-of-frame actors, and so on. Yet only very few directors, and then in parentheses, the greatest ones, have used this implicit dialectic as an explicit means of structuring the whole film. End quote from the quote inside the quote. And going back to Papazian, in Earth, characters are frequently framed up close or in medium close-up, looking off-screen, but often without a subsequent eyeline match, that is, a shot revealing what is being looked at. Moreover, the lack of establishing shots at the beginning of a scene means that what is being looked at often cannot be deduced on the basis of topography alone. Thus, the off-screen glances remain unsolved. Now, to be kind of reductive, Papazian argues that this is partially a staring out at the kind of utopian future being promised by this film, that they are always looking out at something which cannot be told and which is not revealed to us, and thus we are left to imagine what is there. This is perhaps, in another example of Papazian's, most directly pointed out at the end of the film, where in the same moment that Vasil is being buried, his mother is giving birth. And then she says, quote, however, the baby does not appear at all. The mother looks off-screen toward an unseen baby. Like the other side of the window through which Vasil sees the future, this child cannot be shown. He, too, is the future, an off-screen utopian dream whose exact ideological meaning is uncertain. Now, I do want to add a caveat here that although Papazian says that this is an uncertain meaning, an uncertain future, it is not the same kind of uncertainty that I think you can find, arguably, at the end of Cement, right? Where you have our main character, Gleb, whose wife, in parentheses, sort of, is now a stranger to him. He's on a stage looking at a crowd. His friends are all gone. They've been ejected from the party, and they've been replaced by Tsarist officials. His child is dead, and he's kind of dissociating while the triumph of the factory is being declared, right? It's, despite being a foundational text of socialist realism, I think profoundly ambivalent. I do not think this movie is ambivalent about it. As much as it would, we kind of probably want it to be ambivalent. We want many of our great directors of the Soviet era to be detractors, dissidents. Many of them were not. Towards the end of his life, Vasily Grossman could definitely be called a dissident, but in the period where he's doing some of his most well-known works today, Life and Fate, dissatisfied, deeply angry, a feeling that the old era is now just a skin suit worn by people with completely different ideals. Yeah, absolutely. A bloody one, for sure. But one in which he's, again, Life and Fate was written with the intention of being published in the Soviet Union, not for being smuggled abroad in the first place, right? That is ultimately how it is published after his death. It was not his intention. He tried to get that book published. Later in life, yes, by the time you're reading Everything Flows, absolutely. But he was a part of the system. He was in the echelons of power in his life, and so was Dovzhenko. It's tempting to want our great artists to be dissidents, to be people who stand up. And they do in their own ways. Of course, they do. They did. However, Earth is not a subversive film. It is maybe a little ambivalent in places. It's not quite certain about the future, although it is one which is presenting it as a positive thing, ultimately, right? What is this baby going to do? Uncertain. Now, Papazian, at the very end of the film, Vasil's lover's seen embracing another man, which Papazian initially asserts is part of the fact that life goes on. Life goes on is kind of, again, a reductive way of saying it. It's part of a larger point that Papazian is making about how even with, as is wont to do in Soviet texts at the time, the death of the hero is a small thing, right? It is about the society, the people, things are moving on. There is a child that is sort of a replacement for Vasil, although not Vasil's son. It's not a generational thing. It's Vasil's brother. This same generation is birthing the heroes potentially of its own future. That I agree with. Papazian then says something along the lines of, the audience may even think that this is Vasil's brother suddenly grown up in an instant somehow to take this place and march forward in this future, holding Vasil's fiance/lover. I don't know if I agree with that entirely. I didn't get that impression. Neither here nor there. Ultimately, other than that, I can pretty much co-sign Papazian's beliefs or her argumentation almost entirely. But let's go to this article, All in the Foreground, a study of Dovzhenko's Earth by Gilberto Perez. These close-ups that we've been talking about in the context of the people staring off into the distance. Of course, it's not just people staring off into the distance. It is also lots of close-ups of like the fields we mentioned, right? This young woman standing next to a sunflower, the orchards. And Perez argues, and let me quote him directly here, quote, Dovzhenko's style may also be said, introduces this by arguing that Homer's style is known as being of the foreground, in that there is no background. What is happening is almost seems to be the only thing in the world. Dovzhenko's style may also be said to be of the foreground. Literally, he often puts things in the foreground. He uses a lot of close-ups. But what is crucial is the way in which he shows us at any given moment what he shows us in any given moment commands our complete attention. While we watch it, we have little awareness of anything else. In the world of no other director, there is such exclusion from our minds of everything not being shown, such concentration on what each image contains. Another director may show us a close-up of an apple, but generally this will be done, say, because of one of the characters wants the apple to eat, or from some other perspective that takes us outside the apple itself. With Dovzhenko, the apple is the present, the object of our complete attention while it is there on the screen. And this technique creates a lot of interesting different interpretations. So one moment of this close-up, let's go to one of the first shots in the film, this young woman standing next to a sunflower. I've seen completely different interpretations of this scene. Again, interpretations which are not mutually exclusive, which I think is one of the great things of this technique. It's very meditative. Honestly, watching the opening scenes, watching the tractor when it's finally in motion, it makes me, when I was in college, I went to an ag school, and one of the most popular classes was learning how to drive a tractor, which I never took because I felt bad for the actual ag students because it was so popular that it was hard for them to get in, although I think they did get priority. But, now looking back on it, totally regret that. I would love to learn how to drive a tractor. That's what the feeling, the film's effective propaganda is what I'm saying. I was looking at that thinking, man, I'd love to be there. This is very, Garden of Eden, like, living on the land kind of stuff. Tolstoy would love this. But so this moment of this young woman standing next to a sunflower, Perez argues, quote, that the film cuts to a close-up of a young woman standing motionless next to a huge sunflower swaying in the wind. The woman's immobility comes across as the opposite of passivity. It is a resistance to being swayed, an assertion of her own intrinsic energy, her own intensity before the surrounding energies and intensities of nature. That's one way of looking at it. And in other places, in videos and other articles, you'll see interpretations more along the lines of the sunflower swaying in the wind, arguing that it is almost nature bowing to Semyon, right? It is it is emphasizing his connection to the land. He's mowed this land with oxen for 60-something years, and these orchards around them, these wheat fields, these are the product partially of his hand. And I've also seen another interpretation which argues that it is more straightforwardly, bringing in this connection between people and nature. Before this, you just have shots of nature itself, and this moment brings, the young woman and the sunflower are exactly at the same height. And if you've seen sunflowers, they're usually pretty tall. At least the ones around here grow pretty tall. but they're standing at exactly the same height, emphasizing their kind of equality, their almost, hand to hand, standing shoulder to shoulder nature. I would say none of these interpretations are necessarily mutually exclusive. They're different ways of looking at this moment, and in foregrounding all of these things, as Perez is arguing, I'm going off a little bit into my own argumentation here, we are forced to think about what they mean, lacking, frankly, the montage of Eisenstein, right? In Eisenstein, these images contrast, not for the sake of creating that meaning in your mind. In these moments, the contrast maybe sometimes is there, but a lot of the time you're left kind of to build it almost like a Lego set from your own parts. Which of these scenes are logically connected? Hard to say, although arguably all of them. This whole thing is operating not on a literal logic, but it's operating on a dream logic, is something you'll sometimes see it called, which is not so interested in understanding the logic of the world, the logic of how movies usually work, but is much more interested in drawing together these ideas. I think it's Perez who, in another article, I'm trying to find the name right now, I want to say that it is Dovzhenko, Folk Tale and Revolution, in which Perez argues that this is a kind of like a true montage of attractions, right? If we're assuming that this idea of montage is almost like a circus, all these different acts, which themselves are their own thing, but by the nature of how they're presented to you, appear as one show. Now, of course, as another writer in Ukrainian pastoral, Vance Kepley Jr. points out, that despite this idea, Eisenstein was, quote, Eisenstein and Vertov had more rapid, dynamic montage, right? Vertov especially. But these things are much tighter. Dovzhenko's, quote, editing has a more measured pace. The cuts often involve substantial gaps in time and space. Viewers must find the logical connection from one shot to the next that isn't always provided by narrative continuity. And that is, I think, something that creates the power of this film, letting you revel not in the literal, in fact, forcing you away from trying to focus on the literal connections and kind of feeling it. I want to read a quote from Tarkovsky's Sculpting in Time, which I will confess it's not something that I got when I was just reading Sculpting in Time for fun again, but I was reading this article, Death and Life on Oleksandr Dovzhenko by Jonathan Rosenbaum, and he begins it with this epigraph from Sculpting in Time. Quote, "When I speak of poetry, I am not thinking of it as a genre. Poetry is an awareness of the world, a particular way of relating to reality. Think of Mandelstam, think of Pasternak, Chaplin, Dovzhenko, Mizoguchi, and you'll realize what tremendous emotional power is carried by these exalted figures who soar above the earth, in whom the artist appears not just as an explorer of life, but as one who creates great spiritual treasures. In that specific beauty which is subject only to poetry. Such an artist can discern the lines of the poetic design of the being. He is capable of going beyond the limitations of coherent logic and conveying the deep complexity and truth of the impalpable connections and hidden phenomena of life." The more you read about this, the more you'll see connections, not just connections, people making connections between Earth and Mirror, Tarkovsky's Mirror, for example. I was thinking Tarkovsky much earlier when I saw all the friggin' horses in this film. That's probably definitely a reductive way of looking at it. But Tarkovsky clearly is pulling from Dovzhenko here, I've seen at least one other person quoting Tarkovsky, labeling Dovzhenko as one of the greatest directors. So people were. So, if that's something you're interested in, if you like Tarkovsky, maybe watch some Dovzhenko, especially the Silent Trilogy, and see what connections you'll make. Also, Chaplin, we've talked about Chaplin before, people quoting him, but also I was reading some of, sorry, this is super off topic, but I just don't know where to fit this in anywhere else. I was reading a paper which had quotations from Dovzhenko's own biography, in which he mentioned writing a comedy called Chaplin Lost, one of 3 unfinished comedies he had, which is about Charlie Chaplin on a desert island. This is a lack in my knowledge. I don't know why Soviet directors love Charlie Chaplin so much. I clearly got to watch his movie. I mean, I've seen clips. Obviously, I understand that even in a silent film, his comedy works really well. It's, not all that different from comedy we'd have today in terms of like physical comedy. Clearly, I just need to watch more Chaplin to figure out what's going on here. That's something that probably a lot of people know and think that this is a relatively stupid thing for me to be wondering about. But all the same, I am wondering about it. But going back to this dream logic, which is encouraged by the on-screening of these things, right? This is like these are weird things to talk about back to back, the power of the off-screen and the fact that everything is on-screen, right? But that is, not mutually exclusive. The foreground is all that there is. And we, as Perez notes, and as Papazian notes, we are often not given what is on the off-screen, although we assume it exists, but it at times is unimportant enough that we don't get to see it. So we are only seeing the people themselves looking out. We are only seeing the apples themselves. We're not seeing the context they exist in. We are not wondering, does someone want to eat this apple? Is someone looking at it for some reason? We, the audience, are seeing it. We can't say if anyone there is seeing it. This is the people around it at this Semyon's funeral, irrelevant at that moment. It is forcing us to make these connections, which is one thing that, despite the fact that this is not a subversive film, in a sense that looking back on it now, we might look at this and say, yeah, kind of straightforward propaganda. In a literal sense of the overarching plot, yes, it is not subverting that at all. However, that does not mean that it as a work is not making you make novel connections and pushing interesting, very interesting modes of thought into our minds of what is this trying to tell us? Why are we lingering on this? Why does nothing else matter in this moment, right? Perez argues that there's an empathetic reason for this, at least when we're focusing on people. For example, when the tractor is arriving, again, we're seeing this crowd in ones and twos, individual shots, never an establishing shot of the whole crowd of people looking at it. And Perez says, quote, "The tractor is out there somewhere, and we get a few shots of it, but Dovzhenko is more engaged with the people who are waiting for it. There are different feelings about it, and the concern with it they all share. They all look expectantly in some direction, but we are made to look at them." That is an overarching thing in this movie, too. The focus on people, all these close-ups. And as Papazian notes, too, that this is something that... actually, not Papazian, excuse me. This is Perez again. This is something that changes over the course of the movie. And I apologize for the quote-heavy episode, but frankly, a lot of people have explained it better than I could. I appreciate you sticking around anyway. Perez says, note, "In Earth, each image is an island, an intense appreciation of being, self-contained and essentially static. But Dovzhenko doesn't leave it an island. He struggles to connect and unify, chiefly by means of the editing, by the way he brings things together in the assembling of shots. He goes beyond the static appreciation of people and objects in themselves. The very effort to put separate pieces together is what gives the film its forward movement. It is not the movement of pure pattern as in a musical composition, but the movement to establish a pattern against the weight of concreteness, to incorporate into a larger design the individual energy that things possess." And over the course of the film, you can kind of see this in the way that we shoot crowds of people. In the beginning, we've got the funeral and everyone's shot individually. Later on, you start to see people shot in twos and threes. And at the very end of the film, let's talk about the ending now. We have a gigantic crowd following upon us as he walks, and as the crowd carries his son's body to be buried, we now see these actual establishing shots, wide shots of crowds and young people running down out of their houses, down hills to join this crowd. And in this moment, we've gone from individuals to a collective. And that collective is spoken to about the glorious future of the Soviet Union because of them, because this is their land and that's their tractor. And despite what the kulaks have done by shooting Vasil, they will not win because this is the future. And he points up at the sky and says, "Look at Soviet air power, an airplane. That's our future, the skies. We will go upward." And of course, we never see the plane. And again, this is something that Papazian argues is also importantly symbolic, in that we are still stuck on the image of the crowd. We see what they see. We see their reaction, not the spectacle itself. And that is what maybe could be called subversive about this interest in the people. Now, I gotta be frank with you, I kind of suspect they just didn't have an airplane to show, but all the same, maybe they could acquire one and didn't. I don't know. I think Papazian's argument that even if this is not necessarily what was intended, maybe there were supposed to be more intertitles, right? Maybe it was the case that they simply couldn't afford an airplane, or not afford, but couldn't procure one. All the same, the way the film is strong. I don't think adding the airplane would add anything to it, but I do think lingering on the crowd in this moment as they stare up is very interesting, especially as they are finally a crowd of people. And this is actually, frankly, this whole funeral is a really energizing portion of the film. Weird to say about a silent film, but at the same time that we have this march and people singing, we also have Opanas walking at the front, not quite joyous, not singing with the rest of them, but part of this new crowd. At the same time, Vasil's mother, who, again, unfortunately not given a name, is giving birth to his brother at home, new life, although she crosses herself, right? The old ways are still there. Even though Opanas has sent away the priest, she still holds on to these old beliefs. And maybe when we look at it and we think, oh, this is pretty straightforwardly a piece which is arguing for collectivization, how could this been so controversial at the time? Well, look at things like that. The priest is not a monstrous drunk. He's kind of a sad old man who's sent away. The mother of the hero is still apparently religious enough to cross herself in times of concern. There are, crosses throughout marking graves, these symbols of religion. But I may not have too much to say about that. You can see why, when you start looking at it and from that period's perspective, why it still was controversial, but all the same, I don't think that should be taken as an overarching idea that this film is pushing back against it. It very clearly is arguing for collectivization. So Opanas, the mother, is giving birth. At the same time, Vasil's lover is tearing her clothes off and hitting the walls, and there's very ballet, kind of almost beautiful movements of dance in this grief. At the same time, Homa comes up to the crowd and yells says, you'll never have my land, and he's angry. The reason why he shoots Vasil, which I haven't mentioned because it's not important, they took down his fence with the tractor, right? They're coming onto his land because it's all their land now, and that's why he shoots Vasil. And he runs, and he is in these big theatrical movements, finally says to the crowd, "It was me. I'm the one who killed Vasil." But the people are looking at the orator, and they don't care because they see the future that Vasil died in service of. And at the same time, too, while this is happening, we have the priest in the church, and this is being cut all back and forth. This is not scene by scene. These are moment by moment. You're going from one to the next. You have the priest in the church begging God to smite down the sinners. Smite them, O Lord, smite the sinners. It's a really energizing ending. And that's when it starts to go more away from this kind of leisurely editing, right, into these moments that are clearly all happening, we can assume more or less simultaneously, but even if not simultaneously for the purpose of this, right, we are getting, again, this intensely empathetic version of the Soviet socialist realist tale, one which is concerned with the individual people. Even though Homa and the priest might be pathetic in their own ways, you kind of understand them. You can understand why an old priest is driven away by the community might beg for the end of days. Of course, it must be happening. The people are turning away from the faith. You can understand Homa even to an extent, right? It's a more base thing. He wants to keep his land. He wants to keep his money. But Homa even is not the fat cats you get in Eisenstein who in strike are, and frankly, a great hangout room with their big chairs, smoking cigars, wearing their top hats. They're less caricature. You can imagine a Homa. I mean, you can imagine a fat cat too, but, a little bit less cartoonishly evil. Let's say that. A Homa is a little bit easier to imagine. And it's empathetic in that sense. Empathetic in the way that Perez argues that in all these close-ups on people, not always getting what they're looking at. And there's one striking scene when Vasil is shot. This is at a really striking nighttime sequence, and you just have in this dark blue film couples staring out, holding each other, sleeping together. You even get Vasil and his lover in an embrace. Vasil with his eyes closed and his lover staring off with worried eyes into the distance before Vasil walks home dancing this great jig before finally he falls down and a figure runs away from him. You see a horse shaking its head in the next scene, which you assume is a reaction to a gunshot. That's not something you clearly see. It's implied, probably. You understand from the context that this almost certainly has to be a gun, but this is one of those things where it's really not made clear and doesn't matter. He's killed. That's the important thing. It's not the particulars that matter. It's the place that that Vasil plays in the story. Another reason I haven't talked about why this film was controversial is because of its foregrounding of the biological, right? I mean, look at Gilberto. The machine was kind of paramount, right? This change in life was not meant to be, and as the film shows, is people using the tractor to make their lives faster, easier, but part of their normal, traditional lives almost in a sense. Of course, collectivization is changing things, but they're still farming. Now they're farming in much greater amounts. They can all eat a lot more because they have so much more land to farm on, and they can also do it a lot faster with tractors. And as in this one really affecting scene, you see them using the tractor to mow the field. And this is one of the only scenes in which Opanas, Vasil's father, actually looks out and he's scything things by hand. And his son says, put that thing down and check this out, basically. And you kind of see Opanas smile at the speed of this thing, presumably the speed, something about it. And then you go from that to another thing where we jump out of the story itself to, women taking these bundles of wheat which have been cut and tying them together, which are then put into an automatic thresher, which we can understand logically. If the tractor is such a big deal to them, this can't be there. This must be somewhere else. And you go from the thresher to the wheat being, the wheat berries presumably being ground, turned into a dough, and finally made into bread in a factory before jumping back to the village, right? You have this divergence from the rest of the story for the sake of telling the story of this wheat and showing you also what is the outcome of this. Not just it's faster farming, but look how much this produces. Look how quickly it can do it with so much fewer work on the part of the individual. This is a better future for all of us. And it is a better future which is not like a city, not completely like a factory. It is still part of their everyday, how they live, right? It's taking how they live and making it better, but still fundamentally kind of how they lived before. It's not suggesting an upending of the family unit and, a takeover. It's a change in how they do things, a change in governance, but not really a change in their fundamental way of living, which is part of the reason why I was accused of being nationalist in some regard and also overly biological. You can read many of the pieces I'll be linking. We'll talk about how Dovzhenko really, rather than suggesting this revolution of electrification as a complete sea change in life, rather as one which is still in some way at harmony with how they have been living. And one in which you have sort of the life is continuing, right? Vasil is not simply, it's not the hero baby, let's call it that, right? This promise of the future, which we never see. We can only wonder what it will do. It's not his child, right? It's not the next generation is doing better than we are. It is his brother. It is his own generation that is continuing to change. Opanas is now coming around to how he wanted to do things, sending the priest away, demanding this sort of communist secular burial for his son. It is this generation, it's not a complete change of generations, not a revolution. It is a people slowly molding themselves to a new way of being, which is a subtle difference, but an important one clearly to people at the time. Important enough for Dovzhenko to differ pretty wildly on this topic from other people of his time. So it is great. It's exciting at times. It's interesting. It draws you in. And I'm going to break here to talk about a paper which I don't want to harsh on too much. But man, I just want to talk about it because I have never read a research paper. I genuinely thought this must be a graduate student, not as it turns out a full professor. It is called, I just have to talk about it because I've never seen a more predetermined argument in my life. Subversions and Dovzhenko's Earth by Romana M. Bahry. I went in happily to see an argument about how this was a true subversion, because I've seen other papers argue that people believe it is a subversion of the traditional Soviet tale, and then arguing against that. But I'd not actually encountered anyone who truly argued that it was fully subversive. So I was really excited, and I was insanely let down. But so let me read you the thesis statement of this piece. This paper argues that in Earth, Dovzhenko subverts the mandated socialist realist narrative that embraces Marxism-Leninism, the first 5-year plan, industrialization, collectivization, atheism, the new political collective, family, and the elimination of class enemies. He does this through technical means and the introduction of parallel themes. So, decent start. And then it goes on to point out that there are, for example, let's talk about religion. It's a positive depiction of religion because of the amount of religious symbology, the amount of crosses on graves. Semyon's friend at one point is sitting by his grave, which is marked by a cross. Vasil's mother crosses herself before going in to give birth. And she points out, and Bahry points out, that you don't know the beliefs of that baby, which is true, as other people pointed out, may be religious anyway. Sure, that's a possibility, although it's kind of, it says, I guess if I can accept that the future is uncertain because the baby's uncertain, I can accept that potentially it's going to be raised religious. So that feels like it's drifting a little bit from the text to go from it's an unknown to, well, it may happen this way. And then it starts going into other things like, well, the priest is portrayed respectfully because unlike other religious portrayals at the time in which they're, monstrous figures, this is portrayed as a normal man. I would point out that I think everyone is given this sort of empathetic treatment. Empathetic not necessarily in that it's fully taking on their perspective, but you kind of get where they're coming from. But this kind of culminates for Bahry in, at the end, that the priest is given almost as much screen time as the communist orator, and kind of justifies or says, takes seriously his ask to God to smite the people, in which I'm wondering, well, obviously God does not smite the people here. Maybe we can assume it happens afterward, but again, kind of moving away from the text we're actually given. Another kind of weird one, Vasil's lover seems to find some emotional peace, not in any political cause, but at the very end when she's, embracing another man, but in the embrace of a man whose political affiliation is not clear. The supremacy of love between a man and a woman is reaffirmed in that shot, along with the promise of offspring of the traditional family over the new political family. I can accept the political affiliation is not clear, right? In other texts this time, you might expect her to then take on a leading role in helping this new communist revolution come about because personal love is, is underneath the importance of the people. I could accept that, but calling it the supremacy of love between, a man and a woman, reaffirming the promise of offspring of the traditional family, I think that's a stretch. Sorry, I'm just complaining about arguments in here, but I was just kind of shocked reading this. I'm shocked this got published anywhere. It's a big jump to say that this is a reaffirmation of the, offspring of the traditional family. To the extent that Dovzhenko does not have major criticisms for it, yes, and maybe that's where you can say that it is subversive according to the feelings of its time, but I don't know. Maybe we can give this one. It just feels a little, the phrasing, the supremacy of love between a man and a woman in traditional family, is just starting to lay out kind of a worldview here that is feeling like it is overtaking, the argument for the worldview is overtaking what the text has to say, to be honest with you. Now, here's what I think is actually the best argument that this paper has. It kind of jumps from piece to piece. You can kind of get that in the sense of the thesis statement is kind of vague in what it's arguing, and it jumps from argument to argument, paragraph to paragraph. Quote, arguably, Bahry writes, the most subversive shot in the film is one of 3 crosses visible on the empty horizon. The 3 crosses are associated with the crucifixion of Christ between the 2 thieves on Golgotha, a central symbol of Christianity. Okay, maybe. I don't think that really goes anywhere, these 3 graves. But, I'll accept this one. I can accept that argumentation. That is a fairly famous piece of symbolism. I grew up in your church, which had 3 crosses as its symbol. Sure, the argument doesn't develop beyond this point, so I have to question where it's going with this, other than pointing out the use of religious symbolism, which I guess supports the argument that its presence is subversive, so maybe. But this is the one I have a problem with, because this is where I actually think Bahry could have made a stronger argument. Quote, the last shot of Roma shows him collapsing on the ground beside 2 crosses. The associations are with suffering, guilt, sin, transgression, and confession. The implication is that Roma has sinned because he committed murder for which he can be forgiven only by turning to God, confessing, and repenting, as was done by one of the thieves who was crucified with Christ. This would have been grasped at the very least by Orthodox Christian viewers. Another biblical association would be that of Cain and Abel. I included that last sentence because it comes out of nowhere and it's never built upon. I don't understand the association with Cain and Abel. Who is the brother that is being killed because he's jealous of the other? I guess in the sense that Roma could be jealous because Vasil is taking his land, maybe, but they don't appear to have a relationship before this point. Brothers in the sense that they come from the same community, maybe, but I need some more textual evidence for this one, bud. I'm sorry for calling you Bud, Bahry. You probably deserve more respect than that, but I got some real serious questions about your argumentation here. And so the point I was going to make was that Roma does not collapse on the ground beside 2 crosses. Roma collapses on the ground beside 3 crosses, the same 3 crosses that Bahry was talking about earlier, which, if you wanted to make that argument that there is an association with Golgotha here, and Roma is meant to represent Dismas, one of the thieves, not Dismas is not the name given in the Bible, but I like Dismas more than the penitent thief. That would have actually done a lot better. I don't know if that was just a typo or something, because clearly Bahry still makes this connection to Dismas, but it is 3 crosses, not 2. And I just, I don't know that, I don't know if I can co-sign the argumentation that we're meant to believe that Roma can turn to God to be forgiven for this murder. It feels very much like he's being sidelined because he's screaming at the people, confessing his guilt, and they don't care because they're looking at Soviet air power. And Bahry also makes the point that because they never see it, it's a promise which will never be delivered. Okay, sure, I'll accept that. I just, this whole thing is a house of cards that jumps from argument to argument, where I'm like, if you develop some of this, if you want to develop the 3 crosses thing, the association with Golgotha, maybe it just feels like we're building a lot of assumptions into this that were built upon our own worldview. It'll be linked. You can read it for yourself. I'm just kind of baffled by this whole thing. It's just the most nakedly partisan piece of writing I've read on JSTOR, and there's many pieces of nakedly partisan writing. It's just not where I'm usually hanging out, and I'm not trying to say that you can't have a point of view on these things, which maybe is a little skewed. Sure, I usually enjoy that. In fact, we're talking about academics. There's few people more opinionated about very specific things. It's just this one this one's a Stretch Armstrong of an article. But let's bring it back to more important topics, not me just complaining about this. Earth, it is just a wonderfully visual film. If you watch it, you'll realize there are so many moments I have not touched on that are invigorating in a weird sense, inviting you to think, to put these things together, to wonder about their meanings. What are the connections here? Maybe even build your own, and to kind of to finish out in an episode which frankly has been leaning a little bit too hard on other articles. Why don't I do it with one more quote, again from Papazian. I just thought it was a great article. I co-sign it. It kind of articulated a lot of things that I was struggling to put together. Quote, one does not want Dovzhenko to be advocating collectivization, which in Ukraine became a synonym for genocide. One would prefer Earth to resist a plan that was going so wildly awry just as the film was being released in the Soviet Union and internationally. Yet instead of resisting the Soviet utopian ethos, Dovzhenko's film resists interpretation by never revealing the exact referent for that off-screen dream of another world. Dovzhenko obscures the answer to the question of which dream beckons Vasil through the radiant window. Gilberto. In his essay on, quote, discourse in the screenplay of the feature film, unquote, Dovzhenko implies, in fact, one of the distinctive features of the silent cinema was the freedom of the viewer to interpret the film. And then, quoting Dovzhenko, the viewer, in a sense, thanked the director and the screenwriter of the film for their faith in his ability for subtle perception and for the fact that the director, in a sense, placed him in the situation, if not of a co-author, then in any case of a highly developed, subtle appraiser of his art. By 1953, when these words were written, Dovzhenko had been waiting 5 years for permission to make a new film. He must have only been too aware of the consequences of allowing his reader such interpretive freedom, such space for the interplay among author, text, and critic. To say what I've been saying too many times in this episode, the overarching theme of this film, I think, is inarguably in favor of collectivization. It is not subversive in that sense, but it is subversive in the sense that it invites you to be a participant much more than most other films do by the virtue of the fact that it does not go together neatly, and you have to actively work to make those connections. It is not Eisenstein carefully putting these things together to create particular feelings in you. Not that I'm bashing Eisenstein for that. Clearly, that's the technique which is carried on more generally. But Dovzhenko's technique is very interesting. It's unlike a lot of what you've seen. If you like Tarkovsky, you're probably going to like Dovzhenko. It's a lot of meditation. Maybe a little bit less focused on the plot, a little bit less getting into particulars of thoughts, feelings, right? You are seeing things and interpreting more than you get to be told them, as you would in a Tarkovsky film. But all the same, for a film which is nearing 100 years old, 95 and some change now, it is a whirlwind. I would say it doesn't feel its age at all, but I don't want to hold its age against it. In any era, this would be a great piece. This is a fantastically creative, frustrating, frankly, and engaging piece. And it is well worth a watch. Again, it is free. You will find links to it in the description. You can watch it on YouTube. You can watch it on Canopy. I think it's also on Classiki or Classiki. I'm not quite certain how you say it. I'm sure there are other places as well. There might even be DVD releases out there. It's worth your time. It's worth an hour. It is just a fun thing to sit with, a fun thing to watch more than once. Actually, the more I watched it twice, then I was skipping around a little bit later, the more interesting it got, the more you were exposed to it. So maybe we'll cut it there for now. I do want to return to Dovzhenko. I got more thoughts. I want to see the rest of the trilogy, and I want to spend some more time looking into his past so we can give you a decent summary of his life. But for now, that's it. And before I let you go, next up, we will be coming back to Chevengur some point this month. We're shooting for 2. We're coming back to the 2 a month schedule. I feel like I'm in a good enough place for that now, and we're gonna start striving for it again. If you are a supporter of this show, I want to say thank you. For everything that you have done, whether you're a supporter through providing, money, which you can, if you go to SlavicLitPod.com, you can find options to donate there, because podcasting is not expensive, but it's not free either. You help me pay the bills on the website, on hosting, on various other things. Obviously, the cost of the books. This one is free. That was nice. But even if you are just leaving reviews or frankly listening, I appreciate it. You could be spending doing a lot of things with your time, but instead you're here, and I just want to say thank you for making this worthwhile. And I guess I'd say Happy New Year, but you'll probably hear from me again before the New Year, ideally, in case you don't, Happy New Year, but you'll hear from me again.